Birmingham, England, 1908. A letter sits on a mahogany desk. It has just arrived from West Africa, and the man reading it has been dreading it for 3 years. His name is William Cadbury. His family built the most famous chocolate company in Britain. They are Quakers, a religious community that spent 2 centuries opposing slavery, building schools for workers, and insisting that business can be conducted as a moral enterprise. William Cadbury believes this. He genuinely believes this. The letter is from a man named Joseph Burt, an investigator Cadbury himself hired and sent to the Portuguese cacao islands of São Tomé and Príncipe, islands that supply the raw beans for nearly every chocolate bar sold in England. Burt spent years there. His report has now arrived. The words on the page are precise: de facto slavery. William Cadbury sets the letter down. He does not reach for a pen. He calls a meeting. Before we go any further, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. It's one of my favorite parts of making these, seeing where people are tuning in from around the world. Now, let's talk about chocolate. Because the story you've been told about it, the Swiss mountains, the Belgian craftsman, the Hershey kisses, that story is, at best, the last 5 minutes of a very long film. The real story starts 3,500 years earlier, in a jungle. It runs through empires, slave ships, English pirates, Quaker consciences, and a failed candy salesman from rural Pennsylvania who gave away everything he built. And it ends, if it ends at all, with a question that lands directly in your hands. This is the history of chocolate. Almost none of it is what you think. There is a tree in the tropical forests of Ecuador and Mesoamerica that does something unusual. Most fruit trees carry their fruit at the ends of branches. This tree doesn't. The cacao tree grows its pods directly from its trunk, from the bark itself. Thick, warty, almost alien-looking pods the size of a football, in vivid shades of yellow and orange and deep red. They look less like fruit and more like something the tree is trying to say. Inside each pod, a cluster of seeds surrounded by white, sweet, intensely aromatic pulp. The pulp tastes nothing like chocolate. Floral, citrusy, alive. The seeds, eaten raw, are barely edible. Bitter doesn't cover it. Someone, somewhere around 3,300 years before the birth of Christ, looked at this strange tree and decided to do something with it. We don't know their name. We don't know their language. What we know is that the Mayo Chinchite people of present-day Ecuador were working with cacao as far back as 3300 BCE, over 5,000 years ago. And the first thing they probably made from it wasn't a drink you'd recognize. The earliest evidence suggests they fermented the white pulp around the seeds into something alcoholic. Beer before chocolate. The gods got the good stuff first. From Ecuador, cacao moved north into Mesoamerica, into the cultures that would eventually define the entire chocolate tradition. By around 1900 BCE, a ceramic shard from a site in present-day Mexico tested positive for theobromine, the chemical fingerprint of cacao. The vessel it came from was a rounded jar, almost certainly used for drinking. The Olmec were there first among the great civilizations. Their language included the word cacawa by around 1000 BCE, possibly the oldest recorded name for chocolate. No written records survive from the Olmec, so exactly what they did with cacao remains partly inference. But the inference is strong. The vessels, the chemical residues, the linguistic evidence, they all point in one direction. Then the Maya arrived, and they didn't just consume cacao, they built a world around it. For the Maya, cacao was a medium, a substance through which the human and divine worlds communicated. It appeared in mythological paintings, in carvings of court scenes, in depictions of gods holding pods like they were sacred objects, because they were. In the Mayan city of Palenque, one of the great queens, Sac-Cuc, was depicted in stone as being literally reborn as a cacao tree. not carrying cacao, not drinking it, becoming it. And here is something most histories of chocolate skip over entirely. In Maya culture, chocolate wasn't reserved for the powerful. It was available to almost everyone. Many Maya households drank a thick, frothy version with every meal, mixed with chili peppers, cornmeal, honey, water. They poured it between vessels to build the foam, which they considered the finest part of the drink. The Aztecs took that inheritance and monetized it. 100 cacao beans could purchase a slave. A turkey cost 200. A ripe avocado, 3 beans. Counterfeit cacao existed, clay pods painted to look real, because the economy was real enough to be worth cheating. And at the center of that economy sat Montezuma II, the Aztec emperor, the most powerful man in Mesoamerica, who stored cacao in his treasury alongside jade and feathers, served it to warriors before battle, and, according to Spanish accounts that are almost certainly embellished, drank something in the range of 50 cups a day. 50 cups. Whether that number is accurate or the exaggeration of a writer trying to impress readers back home, the point remains, the most powerful man in the Americas organized part of his life around this drink. In 1502, something crossed the horizon that no one in Tenochtitlan had seen before. Ships, and then men, pale-skinned, armored, arriving in canoes. The first European to encounter cacao was not Hernán Cortés. This is one of history's quiet corrections. It was Christopher Columbus. His fourth voyage, 1502, off the coast of Honduras. His crew intercepted a large Maya trading canoe, the largest any of them had ever seen, filled with textiles, copper bells, tools, and cacao beans. When a handful of beans spilled onto the deck, the Maya traders scrambled to collect them with what Columbus noted as extraordinary care, as if the beans were gems. Columbus brought them back to Spain. He presented them at court. He described them, in his records, as a kind of almond. Nobody knew what to do with them, including Columbus himself. They sat in a Spanish storeroom somewhere and were forgotten. History's first European encounter with chocolate ended with chocolate in a box, mislabeled. 17 years later, Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico. He was 33, a trained lawyer who had abandoned law for conquest, and he possessed a particular combination of qualities that made him extraordinarily dangerous: intelligence, ruthlessness, and the ability to recognize value in unfamiliar places. In 1519, he entered Tenochtitlan, a city larger than any in Europe at the time, with causeways stretching across a lake, floating gardens, a great market that stunned every Spaniard who attempted to describe it. And at the center of it all, Montezuma II, in his court, serving chocolatl to his visitor in golden goblets. The question of what Montezuma believed about Cortés has generated centuries of debate. There's a story, originating largely in Spanish colonial accounts written after the conquest, that Montezuma thought Cortés might be the god Quetzalcoatl, returning from the east. Modern historians are deeply skeptical. It's a story that conveniently explains why an emperor with a massive army would welcome an invading force of 500 soldiers. The simpler explanation, diplomatic custom, political caution, an attempt to manage a threat he couldn't yet measure, is probably closer to the truth. What Cortés thought about the chocolatl is better documented. He found it bitter and strange, but he recognized that anything used simultaneously as currency, sacred offering, and military ration had a value that went far beyond its flavor. The Aztec Empire fell in 1521. Disease, primarily smallpox, introduced by European contact, killed somewhere between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of Mesoamerica in the decades that followed. Empires built over centuries collapsed in a generation. The cacao orchards, the trading networks, the ritual knowledge, all of it swept into the colonial machinery of the Spanish crown. Cortés returned to Spain in 1528, with cacao beans and preparation equipment. The Spanish court tasted chocolatl and found it strange and bitter. Cortés knew he had something. He just didn't know yet how strange the road to getting there would be, because Spain, sitting on this discovery, simply told no one. For nearly 100 years, the Spanish crown maintained something close to a monopoly on the knowledge of cacao. Monks processed it behind monastery walls. Aristocrats drank it behind closed doors. The rest of Europe, France, England, Italy, the Netherlands, had no idea. A continent of 50 million people kept ignorant of one of the most significant culinary discoveries of the age, purely for commercial advantage. The secret was imperfectly kept. In 1579, English pirates boarded a Spanish galleon in the open Atlantic, certain they were about to find gold. They opened the hold. Dark, unremarkable beans. They concluded, based on the look and smell, that the cargo was sheep droppings, and they burned the ship. The fortune they destroyed was enough, by the Aztec measure of value, to buy a small city. It took something more intimate than pirates to break the Spanish monopoly. It took a royal wedding. In 1615, a Spanish princess named Anne of Austria crossed the French border to marry King Louis XIII. She was 14 years old. Among the things she brought with her as part of her household and her habits was a taste she had grown up with, one that, until that moment, France had never encountered. Chocolate came to France not through trade or diplomacy, it came through homesickness. The French court noticed, and then, slowly, France developed an obsession. But before chocolate could conquer Europe, it had to become something Europeans could actually enjoy. That required one crucial modification, not made in any royal kitchen, but in a convent in Mexico, by Spanish nuns whose names have been lost to history. Sometime in the 1560s or 1570s, one of them added cane sugar to the bitter cacao drink they had learned to prepare. That was the moment. Not Cortés, not Columbus, not a king or a chemist. A nun in Mexico, adding sugar to a drink, altered the entire subsequent history of a substance that had existed for 3,000 years. The sweetened version made its way back to Spain, became fashionable at court, and became the template for every hot chocolate, every truffle, every candy bar, in the 4 centuries that followed. But here is what that sugar actually was. It didn't come from nowhere. Cane sugar in the 16th century was produced on Caribbean plantations by enslaved Africans. The slave trade and the chocolate trade arrived in Europe simultaneously, inseparably. Chocolate's sweetness and the suffering that produced it entered Europe through the same door, and they have never been fully separated since. If you're finding this story as extraordinary as I am, and we're only just getting started, consider hitting subscribe. There's a great deal more where this came from. In London, chocolate took on a particular character that had nothing to do with royalty and everything to do with power. By the 1650s, chocolate houses had opened across the city. For a penny admission, you could get a cup of hot chocolate and access to news, gossip, and argument. Whigs met in some, Tories in others. Deals were struck, scandals traded, careers made and ended over these cups. White's Chocolate House, which opened in 1693, became the most famous of them all. It's still there, no longer serving chocolate, but operating as White's Club, the oldest and most exclusive gentlemen's club in England. 330 years of continuous operation, on the same address, all of it beginning with an imported Aztec beverage. The government found all of this alarming. In 1675, King Charles II issued a proclamation ordering the closure of every chocolate house and coffee house in England, citing them as centers of political sedition. He was not entirely wrong. Within 11 days, under the weight of public fury, he reversed himself completely. A king retreating from chocolate. It would not be the last time an institution with enormous power found it difficult to control what chocolate had set in motion. Meanwhile, the church had its own problem. The question of whether drinking chocolate broke the Eucharistic fast, the period of abstinence before receiving communion, occupied bishops and cardinals for decades. The faithful wanted to know, could they drink chocolate in the morning without violating their preparation for Mass? Rome eventually ruled that chocolate, being a drink rather than a food, did not break the fast. The decision was welcomed broadly. Chocolate had arrived in Europe as an Aztec ritual substance. It was now being adjudicated by the Vatican. For 200 years after that, the fundamental form of chocolate remained unchanged. It was a drink, expensive, labor-intensive, and exclusive. Then, in 1828, in a factory in Amsterdam, a machine was built that changed the physics of the thing entirely. Coenraad van Houten had a problem that was also an opportunity. His family ran a chocolate business in Amsterdam, and the fundamental difficulty with chocolate, as it had always been, going back to the Aztecs, was fat. Cacao beans are roughly half fat. Grind them and mix them with water, and the fat resists the liquid. The mixture is oily, unstable, impossible to scale. It was one of the main reasons chocolate production had never industrialized. The process was too fussy, too dependent on skilled craftsmen working in small batches. Van Houten was an engineer first. In 1828, he patented a hydraulic press that applied enormous pressure to roasted cacao beans and separated the liquid fat, cocoa butter, from the solid material. What remained was a dry cake that could be ground into fine, dark powder. He also treated the powder with alkaline salts, making it milder in flavor, darker in color, and water-soluble, dissolved easily, tasted better, could be produced in industrial quantities without skilled labor. When his patent expired in 1838, the industry moved immediately. A chocolate manufacturer in Bristol, Joseph Fry, began experimenting with the new inputs. His insight was simple in retrospect. If you could press cocoa butter out of cacao, you could press it back in. Take Dutch cocoa, add melted cocoa butter, add sugar, work it into a paste, and pour it into a mold. In 1847, Joseph Fry produced the first solid chocolate bar. Let that settle for a moment. For over 3,500 years, from the Mayo Chinchipe in Ecuador, to the Olmec, to the Maya, to the Aztecs, to the Spanish court, to the London chocolate houses, every civilization that touched cacao drank it. The solid chocolate bar, the thing you unwrap without thinking, the thing in the checkout aisle, the thing in your desk drawer, that form of chocolate has existed for approximately 175 years, out of a 3,500-year history. The bar is not the history of chocolate. The bar is the most recent chapter. What followed in the next 30 years was a burst of invention that moved almost too fast to track. In 1875, a Swiss chocolatier named Daniel Peter solved a problem that had defeated chemists for decades: how to combine chocolate with milk when water and fat refused to cooperate. He solved it with help from his neighbor, a pharmacist named Henri Nestlé, who had recently invented condensed milk formula for infants. Peter had the chocolate. Nestlé had solved the milk. Together, after 8 years of experimentation, they produced the first milk chocolate. Then, in 1879, a man named Rodolphe Lindt invented a machine that ground chocolate particles to extraordinary fineness over up to 72 hours of continuous motion. He named it the conching machine, after the conch shell it resembled. The result was the smooth, silky texture that defines fine chocolate today, the thing that separates it from everything that came before. 3 inventions, 3 decades, the entire physical experience of modern chocolate assembled in a single generation. But there was a question, underneath all of this, that nobody in the boardrooms of Bristol and Amsterdam and Zurich was asking very loudly. The machines could produce chocolate at a scale Europe had never imagined. That required cacao, and cacao grew only in a narrow band of tropical forest near the equator, in places where the people who grew it had very little say in what they were paid or how they were treated. As the factories multiplied and the demand grew, that question became more urgent and more deliberately avoided with every passing year. In the Gulf of Guinea, off the western coast of Africa, there are two small volcanic islands called São Tomé and Príncipe. Steep jungle mountains dropping into the Atlantic. Extraordinarily beautiful. In the early 20th century, they were a Portuguese colonial possession, and they were the largest cacao-producing territory on Earth. The Portuguese had brought cacao there in the late 1800s, drawn by the climate and by something else: control. Following the independence movements that swept Latin America in the early 19th century, slavery had been legally abolished through much of the Americas. Producing cacao in its original heartland became more complicated, more expensive, more ethically visible. The colonial powers needed somewhere with the right growing conditions and workers who couldn't say no. The islands were perfect. Roughly 280 plantations. Tens of thousands of workers transported from the African mainland under contracts they never signed willingly. The workers could not leave. Contracts were renewed regardless of the workers' wishes. When Henry Wood Nevinson, a journalist sent by Harper's Magazine to investigate, asked workers on arrival whether they consented to their 5-year terms, he reported that in most cases, no answer was given. If any answer was made, no attention was paid to it. A contract was signed. The workers stayed. The European press had a nickname for São Tomé and Príncipe, the Chocolate Islands. The companies buying cacao from the Chocolate Islands included the most respected names in British chocolate: Cadbury, Fry, Rowntree. All three families were Quakers, members of a religious tradition that had formally opposed slavery since the 17th century, that had campaigned for abolition, that built model housing for workers, and pioneered employee pension schemes. These were not cynical men. They were men who had built their businesses as expressions of their values, and they were buying cacao grown by enslaved people. The first warning reached William Cadbury in 1901. A British diplomat raised concerns about labor conditions on the Portuguese islands. Cadbury did not immediately act. He commissioned an investigation. He sent word through diplomatic channels. He waited. In 1905, Nevinson's articles appeared. The public read them. Pressure on the chocolate companies increased, and still William Cadbury waited. Joseph Burt, the investigator Cadbury himself hired, submitted his report in 1908. The language left no room for interpretation. De facto slavery. Not a harsh metaphor, a factual description of a system constructed to appear legal while functioning as something else entirely. Cadbury finally boycotted Portuguese cacao in 1909, 8 years after the first warning. In the same year, The Standard, a British newspaper, published articles arguing that Cadbury had knowingly profited from slave labor while presenting itself to the public as an ethical enterprise. Cadbury sued for libel. The trial ran in 1909. Cadbury won. The jury found in their favor. The judge then awarded damages. 1 farthing, 1/4 of 1 old British penny, the minimum the law permitted, a sum so small it functioned, in the language of the courtroom, as a verdict within a verdict, legal vindication wrapped around moral condemnation. Ghana, then the Gold Coast, a British colony, became the world's largest cacao producer by 1911, as the chocolate companies shifted their purchasing away from São Tomé. A new source, the same structure, and a pattern that had now been established. Once, with great clarity, the industry could absorb exposure, make a change that looked significant, find a new supplier, and continue. That pattern would wait, quietly, for 90 more years. While the supply chain questions lingered unresolved, something else was reshaping chocolate entirely, something that had less to do with ethics and everything to do with war and scale, and a particular man from a particular patch of rural Pennsylvania who failed repeatedly and built an empire anyway. Milton Hershey was born in 1857 near a community called Derry Church, a place so unremarkable that when he later built a factory and a town there, residents held a naming contest. Entries included Ulickit, Etabit, Chocolate City, and St. Milton. The winner was Hershey Cocoa, which the post office rejected as too commercial. So the town became Hershey, Pennsylvania. He grew up poor. His own later description, shoeless and hungry. His parents separated. He completed only the 4th grade. He tried candy businesses in Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago. Failed in all 3 cities, in sequence, before returning to Pennsylvania looking like a man who had exhausted his options. What he came back with, though, was a single insight he'd gathered from years of failure. Fresh milk makes good candy. That observation launched the Lancaster Caramel Company, his first real success, and in 1893, at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, he stood in front of German chocolate-making machinery and became, by the accounts of people who knew him, immediately and completely obsessed. He sold the caramel company for $1 million in 1900 and put everything into chocolate, the formula he eventually developed, a process involving partial fermentation of milk fat, produced chocolate with a slightly tangy, faintly sour quality that European chocolatiers found puzzling. Americans who grew up with it called it chocolate because to them it was. And because Hershey scaled so fast and so completely, other American manufacturers found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Their customers had been trained on the Hershey taste. If they made chocolate that tasted the way it did in Zurich or Brussels, American consumers rejected it. So they had to replicate the distinctive quality that Hershey's process had created almost accidentally. American chocolate taste, for the better part of a century, was engineered by one man's formula. It has never been corrected, because correcting it would feel, to those who grew up with it, like a mistake. During the Second World War, Hershey produced what the Army called field ration D-bars, 600-calorie emergency survival chocolate. The Army's specification was explicit. The bar should taste, in their exact phrasing, a little better than a boiled potato. The reasoning was equally explicit. If the chocolate tasted good, soldiers would eat their emergency ration as a snack and have nothing left when they actually needed it. The bar had to be just unpleasant enough to save lives. Hershey produced hundreds of millions of them, and when the war ended and American soldiers moved through a devastated Europe, they shared what they had, including, inevitably, the better chocolate they'd brought from home. The image of a GI handing a chocolate bar to a European child became one of the defining photographs of the liberation. The field ration D-bars were, by any culinary standard, not good. The symbolism was everything, but the man who made all of this possible was carrying something that had nothing to do with the war. Milton Hershey and his wife Kitty could not have children. This was known. They didn't speak about it publicly. They traveled, Europe, Egypt, the Caribbean, and they built things. Hershey built a factory and then an entire town around it. Tree-lined streets, parks, schools, a trolley system, a public pool, and in 1915, the largest free private zoo in America. He believed, with a consistency that proved it wasn't naivety, that treating workers as human beings produced workers who worked like human beings. During the Great Depression, when most industrialists were cutting jobs, Hershey launched a private building campaign that employed over 600 men, not because the construction was necessary, but because the employment was. A hotel, a sports arena, a theater, a high school. He spent millions at the moment of maximum economic pressure because the people of his town needed the work and he could afford to give it to them. In 1915, Kitty died. They had been married 17 years. Hershey was 57 years old, one of the most successful businessmen in America, with no one to leave it to. In 1918, while still alive, he signed over the controlling stock of the Hershey Chocolate Company to a trust, designated for the Milton Hershey School, an institution he had founded years earlier for orphaned boys. He gave away his company, quietly, without announcement. He had been a poor boy himself. When people asked him later about the decision, he said only, "One is only happy in proportion as he makes others feel happy." The Milton Hershey School still operates. Its trust fund has grown to billions of dollars. It remains, to this day, the controlling shareholder of the Hershey Company. The man who gave the world's largest chocolate company to an orphanage has been dead since 1945. His gift still runs the place. One more detail. In April 1912, Milton Hershey placed a deposit on a first-class cabin aboard the RMS Titanic. He booked passage on the maiden voyage. At the last minute, for reasons that remain unclear, possibly his wife's health, possibly a business emergency, he canceled. The check he wrote to the White Star Line is on display at the Hershey Story Museum in Hershey, Pennsylvania. You can go see it. 1,503 people did not come back from that voyage. Hershey came back. He had 33 more years, and he spent them building things and giving them away. The industry he helped build, though, the vast global machinery of chocolate production, requiring enormous quantities of cacao from tropical regions populated by people with very little political power, that industry had a problem his generosity didn't solve. A problem that, in truth, nobody had really solved since William Cadbury read that letter in Birmingham in 1908. In the year 2000, a camera crew went to West Africa to find out how bad it had gotten. By the end of the 20th century, the geography of cacao had shifted almost entirely to West Africa. Ghana and the Ivory Coast together produce more than half the world's supply. The Ivory Coast alone, a country roughly the size of New Mexico, provides around 40% of global cacao. The farms are small, the labor is intensive, and the price of cacao on the global commodity market is set in trading rooms in London and New York by people who have likely never seen a cacao pod. The average cacao farmer in the Ivory Coast earns less than $1 per day. The average chocolate bar sells for $3 to $5 in an American supermarket. The tropical forest that once covered the Ivory Coast, roughly 16 million hectares in the early 1960s, has largely been cleared. By the early 2000s, less than 4% of that original forest remained, much of it lost to agricultural expansion, including cacao farming that extended illegally into protected national parks. In 2000, a BBC documentary and a Channel 4 film called Slavery, a global investigation, documented what was happening on cacao farms in the Ivory Coast. The footage was specific: children, many of them trafficked from neighboring countries, working on cocoa farms, using machetes to harvest pods, carrying baskets of fruit weighing up to 44 pounds, paid nothing, or close to nothing, unable to leave. The chocolate industry's initial response was denial. U.S. Senator Tom Harkin and Representative Eliot Engel, under very real threat of binding federal legislation, negotiated directly with the major chocolate companies: Nestle, Mars, Hershey, Cadbury, Callebaut. In September 2001, those companies signed what became known as the Harkin-Engel Protocol, a voluntary agreement to eliminate the worst forms of child labor from the cocoa supply chain by 2005. 2005 came. The target was not met. The deadline moved to 2008. 2008 came. The target was not met. The deadline moved to 2010. 2010 came. A new declaration. More careful language. The word eliminate quietly became significantly reduce. Deadlines became targets. Targets became aspirations. In 2015, Tulane University, operating under a congressional mandate to monitor the industry independently, released its findings. Child labor rates in Ivory Coast and Ghana cocoa farming had not significantly declined. In some measures, they had worsened. The 2020 deadline passed. And here is what makes this a story rather than just a scandal. In 1901, William Cadbury received the first warning about slave labor on the Chocolate Islands. He commissioned an investigation. The Burt Report arrived in 1908. He boycotted in 1909. 8 years from warning to action, followed by a trial in which a judge awarded his company 1 farthing, the legal system's quietest possible expression of moral disapproval. In 2000, cameras documented child slavery in the Ivory Coast. The industry denied it, then negotiated a voluntary protocol rather than accepting binding legislation. Deadlines were set and missed. Studies found progress inadequate. The language of the commitments became quieter with each revision. 99 years, 2 exposures, the same pattern almost exactly. The industry absorbed the investigation. The chocolate continued. If this story stays with you, and I suspect it will, the subscribe button is right there. This channel is built for exactly these kinds of stories. Long, real, and a lot more complicated than the version you were told. There is a tree in the tropical forests near the equator that grows its fruit from its trunk. Someone, thousands of years ago, looked at it and decided to do something with it. They fermented it. They roasted the seeds and ground them and mixed them with water and chili and cornmeal and honey. They poured the drink between vessels to build a foam they considered the finest part. They offered it to their gods. They paid their debts with it. They buried it with their dead. They called it, in the language that eventually reached Carl Linnaeus in 1753, food of the gods. Theobroma cacao. He'd clearly done his reading. That tree fed an empire. It was seized by another empire. It was sweetened with the labor of people who were never asked. It was pressed and powdered and molded and wrapped and sold in a million forms in a million places. And at every stage of that process, somebody made money. And the people whose hands touched the tree first made almost none of it. This is not a story about villains. The architecture of exploitation that runs through chocolate's history wasn't built by unusually cruel people. It was built by the ordinary machinery of economic incentive, the search for cheaper inputs, the exploitation of colonial power, the willingness to absorb a bad headline and continue as before. William Cadbury was, by most accounts, a man of genuine conscience. He just found that conscience and his balance sheet pointing in opposite directions, and he took his time resolving the conflict. The Quakers who built the chocolate industry believed they were doing something good. They were building worker housing and pension schemes at the same time they were sourcing from slave plantations. The contradiction didn't make them monsters. It made them human beings inside a system that rewarded not looking too closely. That system is still running. The fair trade movement exists now. It helps. It covers a fraction of global production. Small craft chocolate makers who trace their supply chains directly to specific farms, who pay significantly above commodity prices, they're a growing part of the market, but not the dominant one. The dominant part of the market is still built the way it has largely always been built, on cacao bought as cheaply as possible from farmers who have very little power to demand otherwise. The farmer and the consumer remain the 2 least powerful actors in an industry worth over $130 billion annually. They are connected by a supply chain so long and so opaque that most of the people in the middle prefer not to examine either end too carefully. There's something worth sitting with here. Chocolate is genuinely one of the most remarkable substances in human history. The Olmec and the Maya and the Aztecs were not wrong to treat it with reverence. The chemistry of cacao, the theobromine, the hundreds of flavor compounds that develop through fermentation and roasting, the way cocoa butter melts at almost exactly human body temperature, is legitimately extraordinary. The substance deserves what it gets. It is also built on a foundation that has never been fully cleaned up. These 2 things are both true. Knowing they're both true doesn't mean you stop eating chocolate. It means you eat it knowing what it is. And that knowledge, whether or not it changes your behavior, is a form of accountability that 5 centuries of careful management have worked very hard to prevent you from having. William Cadbury set the letter down. He called a meeting. 116 years later, in a sense, the meeting is still going. But you're no longer waiting outside the room.